Thanks very much, Matthew. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today, and a big thanks to all the organisers. It's my real pleasure here to welcome and to introduce Rupert Read, who's our keynote for the conference today. Rupert's a professor of ecological philosophy at the University of East Anglia, where he works alongside some of the world's leading climate scientists. He'll be leaving academia this summer to devote his time fully to the Climate Majority Project, and Rupert will tell us more about this today. He's written some fantastic books, and I'd recommend, and articles, and I really recommend people seek them out and read them. Founded Parents for a Future. This is another deep adaptation. The one that really got me was his most recent one, which is Do You Want to Know the Truth? The Surprising Rewards of Climate Honesty. And I just want to acknowledge AJ here as well for conspiring with me with the approval of the conference organisers to bring Rupert, who we think is a really fantastic breath of fresh air for us as professionals in the sector, and he really has a strong message for us all here today. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Rupert to the stage.
Thanks for that kind introduction. So here are some things that seem to me to more or less go without saying. I'm not going to dwell on them. They're very familiar to all of you and to any reader of the news at the moment with a few brain cells to rub together. If these matters are going to be addressed, it will have to be done in a holistic way. I mean, for example, you can't actually sort out fundamental issues to do with flooding unless you address upland management, agriculture, sheep grazing, grouse, etc. You can't really address the issue of excrement in rivers unless you're prepared ultimately to look at whether we really want to have massive factory farming of chickens all over the place in some of the ranges of those rivers. So complex issues which require a holistic response and are not easy to fix. But even if those issues were amazingly to be fixed, there would still be something bigger in the background. And I want to talk to you about that bigger picture. So I made this little film. This shopping mall, your home, my home, Jeff Bezos' multiple homes. All we've created, everyone we love, everyone yet to be born. London, Paris, New York, Melbourne, Mecca, Mumbai. Everywhere and everyone is now on the climate front line. We've put too much pressure on the living systems on which we depend. The house of cards is starting to fall. And so, like so many before it, our civilization is unraveling. Yes, we could have prevented this had we acted decisively decades ago. And no doubt the reasons why we didn't will be debated in future by students and law courts, if there are any. What we can still control, to an extent, is how hard the landing is. How many people survive? How many other species get taken out? What parts of the globe remain habitable? If we dare. Do we dare to accept that we, the most intelligent species ever to have evolved, have made the most colossal mistake in all geological time? Do we dare to turn and face the unimaginable horror as it overwhelms our friends and neighbors here and abroad, and maybe, of course, ourselves? I think we do. I think we can decide to put our energies, our intelligence, and our famous human spirit into ensuring that the ending of this civilization is as transformational as possible. Let's save as many people. Let's restore as many habitats. Let's rebuild what's worth rebuilding. And while we're doing so, let's collectively rethink what it's all about, so that if we get another chance, we can do things much, much better. Ashes are now inevitable. What grows out of them? Well, that's all to play for. So this is me. And after that, some of you might have a question on your minds along the lines of the following slide. How bad is it going to get? And here one might quote from Legolas the elf in Lord of the Rings, a great myth about a time when a huge threat was slowly arising, and because it was arising only very slowly, despite its hugeness, no one really turned and faced it till it was awfully late in the day. A premise which might remind you of something. When Gandalf the wizard falls apparently to his death in Moria in Lord of the Rings, the elves sing these great songs of mourning, and the hobbits ask the elves, what are they singing? What are the words of these songs of grief? And this is what Legolas replies. So what I have to do is try to summon up the heart to tell you how bad it's potentially going to get. So here goes. So I work alongside some of the world's leading climate scientists at the University of East Anglia. And sometimes we have a drink together at the end of the day or something. And maybe I ask them a question like, what's the latest data? How is it looking? Where are we headed? And let me tell you what they say to me. What they always say is, well, it's worse than you think. It's worse in particular than our published papers say. Where we are, where we're headed, it's almost certainly worse than that. Now, why is that? Well, the answer is quite simple. Scientists are conservative creatures. They don't like to say anything unless they can prove it. They copper bottom everything, especially climate scientists, because they've had a long history of being attacked by so-called skeptics and deniers. So what appears in the published papers, let alone in the IPCC, which is a sort of 2 or 3 years late précis of those papers, what appears in their papers is always the minimum of how bad it's going to get. What they actually fear, what they actually expect, is always worse. And this implies that the rhetoric that we tend to use in relation to climate, this rhetoric which you'll have heard over and over again of, it's 5 minutes to midnight, time is short, but we can do it if we just pull together. This is your final warning, we heard from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change earlier this year. This rhetoric is kind of wrong. It's later in the day, always, than such rhetorics. It's 5 past midnight. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that lots of damage is done. Lots of bad stuff is already baked in. When you hear it's our final warning, it's our last chance, for example, to stay below 1.5 degrees centigrade of average global overheat, which is supposed to be the safe guardrail, the safe upper limit, which we should keep climate to below, that's for the birds. We're not going to stay below 1.5 degrees, and that is starting to be recognized. And in fact, even while I was preparing these slides, there were dramatic developments in relation to 1.5 going on. We actually were above 1.5 degrees of average global overheat in the first week of June. What's the significance of 1.5 degrees? You might think it was just a number. No, it's not a number. It's a planetary boundary. This is from the great Johann Rockström, the guy who invented the idea of planetary boundaries. Basically what that means is, obviously it doesn't mean that when you reach 1.5 degrees of average global overheat, suddenly there's this absolutely sudden tip. That would be absurd. What it means is that the kind of damage we get between 1.5 and 2 is potentially an order of magnitude higher than the damage we've had so far. There's a lot of feedbacks and so forth that kick in once you go over about 1.5 globally. Don't take my word for the fact that 1.5 is gone. So here is a tweet I put out a year ago, since when the situation has worsened. after a meeting of the entire UEA climate community. There's this slogan, 1.5 is alive, 1.5 to stay alive. So we asked the room, how many people in the room believe that 1.5 is alive? How many people in the room believe that staying below 1.5 degrees is even a possibility? And not one person said that they thought it was even possible. So this is the reality, not this stuff you get in the papers of, oh, it's our last chance, there's still just about time. No, it's gone. It's 5 past midnight. And 1.5 is kind of iconic, but it's by no means the only elephant in the room charging towards us. El Nino is here. El Nino is the world's biggest weather system. Believe it or not, in the last few years, we've been in a phase of abnormally low temperatures. Seems a crazy thing to say, given that we hit 40 degrees centigrade in the UK last summer for the first time ever. But the La Nina system was operating worldwide over the last couple of years. We've now shifted into El Nino, which boosts temperatures much higher. That's why it's likely that we will exceed 1.5 degrees, not just temporarily, but for a substantial period of time during the next couple of years as we go through the El Nino, potentially a super El Nino. And even more disturbing, some of you may have noticed these stories appearing about record ocean temperatures, a sudden spike in ocean temperatures, which is proving devastating for ocean wildlife. No one quite understands this. It's possible that what's happening is that the cleaning up of world shipping is removing sulfur, i.e. removing pollution from the atmosphere, and we're suddenly getting a spike of heating that's been artificially suppressed by all that pollution being in the atmosphere. And then there's something even bigger, the Gulf Stream. I won't try and take you through all the technicalities of this, but you'll be aware that we're actually quite far north in Britain. The Gulf Stream keeps our weather, as it were, unusually, or you could say artificially, warm compared to other similar latitudes. And one of the terrible ironies of the climate situation of global overheat is that that may be about to change. The Gulf Stream is weakening. The entire North Atlantic Ocean currents are being disrupted because of all the melting that's happening now in Greenland and in the Arctic more generally. If I were a betting man, I'm not, but if I were a betting man, and if I were unwise enough to hazard a guess as to where the world's climate is going in the next decade or two, I would bet that actually Britain is likely to see a fairly sudden change in the next 10, 15 years. And you'll be hearing more about this probably during this year because scientists are starting to really get very serious about this issue of Gulf Stream weakening and making projections around it. Where we're headed could be not hotter conditions, but colder conditions, and especially for your concerns, drier conditions. So we could be heading into a period where we're getting hotter and drier weather because of the general global overheat, or it could be that in Northern Europe especially, we flip into drier but colder weather, which will be very, very bad and very difficult for agriculture. If I were a betting man, I would actually bet on that. The last line of this slide, by the way, is a little nerdy joke for those of you who are in the know. The technical name for the Gulf Stream is the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Current, or AMOC for short. The AMOC is running amok, I'm afraid. And yeah, we have to try and find things to laugh about in these difficult times. What does this mean? What does this imply? What should we do about it? Well, the book that Amanda mentioned, Deep Adaptation, what is deep adaptation? You'll all be aware of the concept of climate adaptation as water people. Deep adaptation takes it one step further, however. Deep adaptation says most of what's been called adaptation is actually pretty shallow. It's about trying to keep the existing system afloat as the climate changes and worsens. But we need to actually think beyond that. We need to think into the potentiality that we may not be able to control the response of society and civilization to these difficult conditions.
Deep adaptation is the ability to adapt to the now inevitable chaos caused by climate breakdown and to prepare for potential partial or total civilizational collapse. I emphasize the word potential. Some people believe that civilizational collapse is now inevitable. That is not my belief. But my belief is that, in the proverbial phrase, fail to prepare, prepare to fail. And moreover, we also have to actually now prepare to fail, or rather prepare for potential failure. Because if we do fail, and if we're not prepared for it, it will be a lot worse than if we are. We can't just focus anymore on mitigation. We have to focus on adaptation, and we have to focus on adaptation that takes into account the full gamut of possibilities, including the very worst. So, a question. Is the water industry capable of deep adaptation and transformative adaptation? Transformative adaptation is adaptation that tries to transform the system as it goes along, rather than just keep the existing system, which is the one that's brought us into all this trouble, going. Is the water industry capable of such things? So a few sub-questions there for you. How will the industry cope with increased frequency and severity of floods and drought, including potential permanent drought, as in the amok failure scenario that I sketched in the previous slide? What does waste management look like under extreme scenarios? How will the water industry deal with and crucially prepare for potential disruption of energy supply? A reckoning is coming. I'll mention another work of art, less well known than The Lord of the Rings, but it's very, very good. I do recommend it. It's called Take Shelter. It's a film about 10 years old. It's one of the very, very few good works of art we have yet which directly allegorizes the climate situation. And the central character, the protagonist, is a man who has visions of a terrible storm that's coming. And these visions get stronger and stronger. And as they do, his behavior becomes more erratic. And his neighbors and co-workers start to think that he's going insane. And there's a kind of culminatory scene in the film where he rants to all of them at a dinner. And he rants roughly along the following lines. There is a storm coming, and not a one of you is prepared for it. But often when people rant, they don't get listened to or taken very seriously. So I'm going to just say this. There is a storm coming, and not one of you is prepared for it. Some of you might think, isn't that a bit of an arrogant thing for him to say, though, because he's standing out there and he makes it sound as though he knows what it's all about, as though he's lecturing us about something he's ready for and none of us are. But that's the thing, you see. I'm not prepared for it either. And part of the reason I say that is because the only way we can actually prepare these things and prepare for them is if we do so together. Prepping on an individual basis is meaningless. The minimum viable unit is something like a resilient community. And of course, in our world, there are lots of interdependencies, some of which we need to reduce, but we need to be thinking about these things on community levels, national levels, and international levels. And that's the only way we can possibly prepare. So, here is someone who might be able to help us with the kind of spirit we need for such preparation. And it's very striking that in 1940, Churchill didn't say to this country something like, don't worry, it's all going to be fine. And he didn't say, I've got a really positive story to tell you about what the future looks like. And he didn't say, this is your final, he didn't even say, this is your final warning, but if you listen to this warning, we can get it all sorted. What he said was, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. And the British people responded to that. As the quote continues there, you might ask yourself, what does victory look like in the case of the climate emergency? And that's a very good question. It's much more difficult than a war, right? You can't just kind of win and then go back to something like normal, or at least a new normal. The truth about what's coming is hard to accept. Yet we must face it to save lives and to survive. We will not adequately until we face up to climate reality. And with the precedent of World War II in mind, I want to suggest to you it's time we trusted people. It's time we trusted ourselves. It's time we trusted that when people get to hear and feel and face together the extremity of our situation, that they will respond to it adequately. And such trust of ourselves and of each other and of the nation implies, among other things, full disclosure about what is coming and what our chances are and what our options are. Because remember, it's 5 past midnight. We're in what Churchill called the age of consequences. But I suggest to you that we can do this, as we did before in the Second World War. Moreover, we can gain from undertaking this great work. It can give us meaning. Consider the intriguing fact, for example, that in the extremely difficult circumstances of the Second World War, suicide rates in the United Kingdom and other Allied nations fell. Why was that? Well, arguably because people had something to live for amidst all the dying. Okay. To sum all this up, our children will only have one serious question for us when we are looking back on our lives with them. And I think you know what the question is, basically. I'm not going to spell it out. I'm going to give you a little blank slide there to reflect for a second. There is no exact form of words for this question, obviously, but the rough form of the question, I take it, is something like, once you knew, and once you know, you can't unknow. Once you knew, what did you do? Once you knew, what did you do? And that takes us to the response that myself and colleagues are bringing together to this. It's called the Climate Majority Project. Over the last several years, climate activism has become more radical, which has resulted in it becoming more polarizing to the general public. So what we accomplished with Extinction Rebellion and with Greta in 2019 really raised people's consciousness, opens people's eyes and minds and hearts. But it also caused a sort of fight, which we're continuing to see today. In the Climate Majority Project, we think that climate breakdown being self-evidently the most important issue of our time, it can't be allowed to become a factional issue. It's got to be depolarized. There's got to be a wave that everyone can be a part of and can get behind. And that's the idea of the Climate Majority Project. The idea is for parents acting as parents, professionals acting as professionals, people in their communities and in their neighborhoods acting together, people in their churches acting together. Everybody in the absence, the gross absence of sufficient political leadership, starting to lead from the bottom up and pointing in the right direction. And if enough of that happens on the basis of the truth, handling the difficult feelings that have been evoked by that truth together, if enough of that happens and starts to arise and co-arise, and if people notice it, oh, it's popping up all over the place. Lawyers doing the right thing, insurers starting to do the right thing, people in their local communities seeking to become more resilient. If that starts to happen at scale, then that will in turn change the political culture and make it impossible for our leaders to no longer be leaders. Make it certain that they will start to finally step up. And what's your role in this? Well, a key element of the Climate Majority Project is encouraging professionals to get together, to tell the truth, to disclose what they know, for example, about the vulnerabilities of our systems and our lack of preparedness. To warn, and thus to help us all to prepare. To act as professionals together with a full professional responsibility at this extraordinary time of peril. So do you feel it? Do you feel the fear? If you feel some fear, that's good. If you're not sometimes afraid at the current time, then you're not paying attention. Do you feel the tugs on your heartstrings? Well, that's very good. Do you feel perhaps a bit of excitement? That's very good too. We all want the best for our kids, and that now means a decent life that is compatible with then having a future, or put it another way, change the N to an M, with them having a future. And that is not going to happen unless we rise in the kind of way that I've indicated in this little talk. And I want to say in closing that I believe that we can do this together, that you can do this. I mean that. Collectively, you have much more agency than the average citizen in this country. You are placed superbly to contribute meaningfully to this. You can be heroes, and not just for one day. That's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Rupert. It's Matt from Severn Trent. What would your advice be to the people in the room where there's going to be difficult decisions to make? Because often in our industry, there's no best answer. It's more pick an option that's got less of an overall impact on carbon emissions, but that may mitigate the effects of those carbon emissions in the first place. So how do we navigate those difficult decisions?
Yeah, great question. Obviously a huge question. I'll say a couple of things. One would be disclosure. So try to make evident to elites, to the public, that there are these difficult choices, and don't shy away from them. Trust that there is a chance that we'll face up to them and be woken up by them, indeed, further, if they are opened up, but not if they're not. Another thing I would say is, where possible, aim for what I only briefly touched on in the talk, but which I think is actually an ideal, which is transformative adaptation. So shallow adaptation, just trying to keep the existing system going. So, building more huge reservoirs in northern England, for example, to try to guarantee water supply and having huge long pipes from them to the south, can only ever be one fragment of the answer. It's carbon heavy and brittle and fragile. Deep adaptation is unavoidable and necessary, but we don't want to only prepare for collapse. We want to try to avert it. So the idea with transformative adaptation is, how do we bring about together over time a system change that copes with the impacts while transforming the system in the kind of direction that it needs to transform in anyway? And hopefully when you're faced with the kind of choices that you're talking about, there will usually be, not always necessarily, but there will usually be a sort of transformative adaptation style option, if that makes sense.
Got one down the front, and
My name is Ian Bernard from Oxfinity. Thank you for a wonderful presentation and quite an eye-opener. You mentioned adaptation several times, but you haven't mentioned innovation. How much innovation should the water industry do, or how can we accelerate the innovation to really move adaptation another step forward?
Yeah, great. Well, look, obviously in many of the technical details, you all will know far more about that than me. The one thing I would say is this. Underlying my talk is the idea that we should be more precautious, that we're being profoundly reckless at the present time. And that the precautionary thing to do is to try to prepare for a future which is profoundly uncertain. For example, we literally don't know whether this country in the 2030s will be hotter or colder than it is now. And that makes it quite difficult, right? But that you have to live in and adapt to transformatively, hopefully, a world that we don't fully understand. Now, where this speaks to innovation is in the following way, it seems to me. People sometimes say, or think, or assume that technological innovation is a way we can get around the need to have to be precautious. But this is not true. If you try to technologically innovate your way out of a situation without being precautious, without taking full account of the massive systemic, including epistemic uncertainties under which we operate, then you are further fragilizing the system. What we need to do is put innovation to the service of precaution. And in fact, this is very common. It's happened again and again when people have, as they haven't, not often enough, but as they sometimes have, been precautious in the past. So, for example, when you start to realize, I'm going to give you an example from another field, when you start to realize that certain pesticides may be harmful, deeply harmful to bees, not necessarily that they are, just that they may be, right? That's a spur to innovate and to find alternative ways of managing your farmland, for example, which don't depend on the use of such pesticides. And that's not a random example, that's an actual example. The EU banned various pesticides because they were maybe bee killers before it was proven that they were bee killers. Because if we'd left it until it was proven, we'd have left it too late, right? So being precautious, which is what I've been urging you to do, is a spur to innovation. The two go hand in hand. Don't let anyone ever tell you, oh, if we innovate cleverly enough, then we won't have to take precautions.
I think, do we have time for maybe just 2 more quick questions? I'd love to take a lady, if we've got one. Is that all right? Yeah. Last one, okay. Do we have a last question then? Oh, there we go. I think we've got a lady, if that's all right. I'm sorry, I've forfeited. But Rupert will be available for the next half hour or so in the convention centre next door if people would like to have a further chat with him.
Hi, there's another quote that really resonates with what you've said, and that is that philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. So I think what from where I come from, I can't see how we can change the damage to the climate without some fundamental changes to the way we run society and the way the systems are, because it's so baked in to the drive for profit and accumulation and just growth.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course you're right. And the famous quote you gave is, of course, music to my ears, because that's exactly describing my current career path. I've been an academic philosopher, and I'm now devoting myself full-time to the Climate Majority Project to try to change what is coming. And that's the essence of my answer. The situation that we have faced is extremely difficult, much more difficult than most people have been willing to admit. If we do start to face it together, then that can change. And that's the only way it can change. And the idea of the Climate Majority Project is to do exactly that, to face it together. And for people, wherever they are together and have potential voice and power, to start to use that accordingly. As I say, when that starts to happen, and it is starting to happen already, when that starts to happen at scale, then we'll be in a position to actually start to change the system in the way that we have to. Because make no mistake, system change is coming. Because if a society endures collapse, that's a system change. Right? System change is coming. It'll either take that form, or it will take the form of us managing to do it innovatively together ahead of that occurring. And it's pretty obvious which of those two options is preferable.